Hello everyone and welcome to episode 16 of the History Hotline. My name is Deanna and I will be, as always, your host for today. Today I decided that, if you've been listening to these episodes for a while now, you'll know that they tend to focus on 20th century Britain, particularly looking at the Windrush generation in this country. But today I thought we would go back in time to the 1800s, the mid-1800s, and we'd look at a little bit of art, essentially. And this episode, as you know, is titled Fanny Eaton. And Fanny Eaton was a model for the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and their circle in England. And this would have been in around the 1860s. So I thought I'd start by telling you about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood if you are not, interested maybe in art necessarily and you don't know what that is or you've heard of it. We'll clear up what that is. And then we will talk about Fanny Eaton, her life, and why she is someone notable and someone we should think about and speak about when we are speaking about art and British art, essentially. So the Pre-Raphaelites were essentially a secret society of young artists and one writer. They began in London in 1848, and basically it was a movement that was kind of opposing what the Royal Academy was promoting in regards to the ideal works, and those works in particular were the works of Raphael, who was an Italian Renaissance painter. And so this kind of group that started was a revolt against the genre, and which was a really popular genre at the time, and it was inspired by kind of theories of John Ruskin, who urged artists to essentially go into nature to take inspiration for their work. They focused a lot on religious themes, but also used inspiration from literature and poetry. Some of the kind of most notable and principal members were William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millias, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he was Christina Rossetti's brother. If you know who Christina Rossetti is, she is a poet and writer, and I think her work, Goblin Market, the poem, was the artwork for that was done by Dante, her brother, and essentially that kind of fit into that Pre-Raphaelite movement of kind of nature and all the fruits. Obviously, if you've read Goblin Market, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I think it was on my GCSE or A-level poetry anthology for English Lit. If anybody else was subject to that, then I'm sure you'll remember all the fruit and everything that was mentioned in that poem. But essentially, a lot of different mediums and artistic mediums came together in this movement. And then, we are going to get to a point where we think about Fanny Eaton and how she plays into this movement as well, because I haven't really mentioned yet, but, we do tend to speak about Black British history. And Fanny Eaton was a Jamaican-born woman. Her mum was of African descent, and her father, whilst not listed on her birth records, he was assumed to be white and European. She was an illegitimate child born to a woman that would have at some point, I believe, been a descendant of enslaved people, but she was essentially a black woman. She was mixed race, and she was used as part of this movement and this artistic movement, and she really, I would say, challenged the standards of beauty that were upheld by movements before that and by Europeans in general. This idea of being as pale and as close to white as possible, and having a certain set of features. Fanny Eaton would not have looked like that at all. There will be pictures on Instagram and Twitter when I upload this episode, so have a look at those and have a look at her as a woman, and you'll understand, I think, how, should we not say groundbreaking? Well, maybe, yeah, how groundbreaking she was, because she really did, I'd say, challenge the standards of beauty at the time. So, Fanny Eaton was born in Jamaica in 1835, as we have already mentioned. Now, 1835 in Jamaica is essentially, slavery has been abolished. However, slavery essentially is still occurring because there was a really long, extended period of apprenticeship where those people that were previously enslaved had to work to essentially kind of work themselves out of their condition. And also it meant that the plantation owners could essentially just get as much out of them as possible, even though slavery had ended. So they were working under the same system basically, but it just had a different name. So you can imagine the kind of time period and just how long ago essentially this was, to think that people were essentially not legally but literally enslaved. And Fanny Eaton, as a mixed race woman, she would have been known as a mulatto at the time. She is, born to a black woman, a black mother, and her father is not known, and she obviously has no relationship with him. So essentially in 1840, her mum decided that they would travel to England and move there. So off the two of them went, and she worked as a domestic servant. Eventually, Fanny Eaton got married. She married a man called James Eaton. Sorry, her name before was not Eaton. It was Antwistle or Entwistle. Not too sure on that. And historians tend to give both. So she got married to a man called James Eaton, who was a cab driver in London, and the two of them had 10 children together. Fanny Eaton worked as a cleaner and a laundress during her time in London, and then she also would model for artists because she needed a way to kind of supplement her income. Essentially, it was like her side hustle. Her second stream of income came from modelling, and this was kind of during the 1860s. And thankfully, because she was a model and her, the artists that painted her had such acclaim, we have these records of her, and we have images of her because she was, the artist's inspiration, and she was the subject of many pieces of artwork. The most notable, I think, pieces of art that we would see Fanny Eaton in are Frederick Sandy's Morgan Le Fay, which is held at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, and Albert Moore's The Mother of Sisera, which is at Tulle House Museum in Carlisle, and also Solomon's The Mother of Moses, which I think is probably, if you know about Fanny Eaton, that is the most kind of famous one, I guess. And I think that is held at Delaware Art Museum. And also she's on record to have modelled and to have been kind of paid by a group of artists, and so whilst these are kind of the pieces of artwork that are most recognised and most notable, she would have maybe been used as a muse by other artists. Maybe their work didn't come to the same acclaim as the ones mentioned before, or she would have been part of informal life classes organised by that group of artists in order for them to, I guess, practice and to just create, essentially. It's said that by around 1870, she would have essentially given up modelling, as I don't think there are any records of her doing anything after that. In 1881, she was widowed, living in Chelsea with her 7 children who ranged in age from 2 to 24 years old. So you can imagine, I can see why she essentially needed a second stream of income, because she had so many children, and obviously they have to be fed and everything, whilst the oldest one was 24. I'm sure that they would have probably been able to fend for themselves in some way and also contribute. And yeah, she went back to kind of working as a seamstress. She was employed as a cook later on, and essentially worked as a model for one particular phase of her life, and didn't really do it as, her only career. So not like maybe a model today that their sole career is a model and they are known for that and known for little else. Fanny Eaton had to do other things, and the modelling was not necessarily her personal aspiration, but a way of supplementing her income, essentially. And I doubt she maybe would have known the impact that she would have had maybe when she was modelling, essentially. So when we think about Fanny Eaton and her modelling, her beauty is described as being unparalleled, and there is a debate with art historians that basically is asking the question, was the use of Fanny Eaton as a model empowering, because it showed off her beauty in a kind of dignified way and a socially conscious manner, and she was obviously different to the standard of model that was traditionally used, Or was it a form of exoticization? Was she being othered because she looked so different? And was it a bit of a come see this woman that, you know, looks different to the standard British person in this country? And art historians have debated this for quite a long time. And I don't necessarily think there is a right or wrong answer. Essentially, it is a debate at the end of the day. Interestingly, there is an art historian called Pamela Nunn who observes that the kind of strikingness, if that is a word, of Fanny Eaton is the kind of ambiguity that her ethnic identity presents. It's not necessarily clear from pictures of her where she's from, and it's this ambiguity that, you know, leads to the kind of, not necessarily her beauty, but why these images are so striking and so different, essentially. And I think, whilst I don't know if the debate has gone here, I'm sure it has at some point, but this idea of ethnic ambiguity is definitely in some ways a problematic point when we think about standards of beauty, but it's definitely something we even see now today within celebrity culture, and the people that are upheld as being beautiful tend to be in some ways ethnically ambiguous. And I think this comes from a place of exoticization and of exoticizing what is different and what is not the standard. Now, we've got to remember we are thinking about art and standards of beauty essentially in the Victorian era, and they were very white, to say the least. Trends at the time centred around pale face, rosy cheeks, big dark eyes, and any kind of blemishes, so whether that be pimples or freckles or anything like that, were said to be unsightly, and they were not obviously unwanted. And so there were cosmetics that were made by pharmacists to essentially cure you of these skin problems, as they were known in the Victorian era. Now, you know, that being said, how does someone like Fanny Eaton, who is a mixed race woman and who would have been described as having dark skin, although we would never say that, you know, now in the 21st century and in 2020, of, you know, someone mixed race being dark, she is described as dark, yet she is used as a muse. And, you know, in art, as long as you're represented in a certain way, you are said to be representing, I say in some ways, a standard of beauty, and she was represented in a very dignified way in the art pieces. And I think it kind of speaks to the nature of the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood and their aims in regards to the kind of artists and muses that they wanted to draw. Now, that being said, you know, when an artist draws, an artist doesn't necessarily have to draw what's right in front of them. And so there are suggestions that, you know, even within some of the art pieces, Fanny Eaton may not look exactly as pictured, because artistic interpretation, is it artistic interpretation? I think that's a thing. I am no art historian, by the way. I just figured that we would talk about someone that was used as part of the Google Doodle, actually, I think last month, and is often recognised as someone that is forgotten by history, you know, and again, another black woman that has been essentially erased from the historical record. However, I will say that, you know, whilst Fanny Eaton may not be known, you know, within the mainstream as a model, and for kind of what she did in her life, she's definitely recognised when looking at her through the lens of Victorian art and through obviously the Pre-Raphaelite movement, and the work that came out of that. A lot of the discourse around Fanny Eaton that I've read in preparation for this episode, and as a result of the Google Doodle that came out last month, has been quite interesting, I would say. A lot of articles, especially written by some magazines that focus a lot on beauty, you know, the kind of magazines that I mean, those like lifestyle and fashion magazines, they tend to focus on Fanny Eaton as some kind of trailblazer for black women in the modelling industry, which is a little bit of a reach, I would say. You know, she was an artistic muse, and she was a subject to be painted in the Victorian era. I think the probably most useful commentary about her is the fact that we don't necessarily know about her, and I think that kind of speaks to the erasure of black women in history. And something I've realised that I'm going to say I'm guilty of, because I was looking back at the episodes that I've done so far for the History Hotline, and I really started this with the intention to speak about black women so much more, because that's what my research tends to focus on. And I've realised I've been speaking about men in so many of these past episodes, especially in the Windrush generation and especially of Jamaican descent, which is quite a narrow focus and not what I wanted necessarily for the History Hotline. So stay tuned for episodes that are more focused on black women, and not just in the Windrush generation, because, you know, black people have been in Britain. I always say this, before the Windrush came, and they featured in so many different societies and made a mark on Britain in so many different ways. And Fanny Eaton was definitely one of those people. While she didn't necessarily, you know, become an activist or try and champion the rights of black people, I don't think we necessarily need to think of individual exceptionalism as a standard for thinking about black people in history. As I've said before, when we spoke about Black History Month and who we should celebrate, it always seems as if it's those who have contributed, and we measure that kind of standard of whether or not we should be remembering them by what they have contributed and how much they've contributed. And I don't necessarily think that is the case for every single person that we think about. We should also look into black people essentially just existing in certain spaces in Britain in different decades and in different eras. And I think looking at Fanny Eaton and understanding her life and her work, we're able to kind of get a glimpse into the different ways and into the very diverse nature in which black people navigated British society from the 3rd century, you know, down to the Windrush generation. And so that is everything we're going to talk about today. As usual, if you have any questions or anything you want to raise that has come out of this episode, any thoughts that have been sparked, please feel free to send us a message on Instagram at The History Hotline, on Twitter at The History HL, or leave a comment on Apple Podcasts. Please leave a review. Please give us 5 stars. It really does help with ratings. And also follow us on Spotify, and we are also available on Google Podcasts now. I don't know if I've mentioned that before. So please do, if you have the chance, leave us a review, give us a rate. It definitely helps us. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Wishing you a wonderful week. Goodbye.